I want to welcome you back this morning to our study of the background of the New Testament. We've been taking some time over the last several weeks to go back into ancient history and look at the events, the cultures, the kingdoms that set the stage for the first century, of course, with the ministry of Jesus and the apostles and the establishment of the church. And there's a lot of history to cover. We've worked our way in this class period up to what we're calling the Persian Empire. And we want to spend some time talking about that. Of course, the Persian Empire was the empire that took over from the Babylonians. Talked some about that in the last couple of class periods. We'll mention that in passing again this morning, but what we want to do is look at the Persian Empire from a little bit wider view and give you some historical info that may help you understand some things. The Persian Empire is a name given to a series of dynasties centered in modern-day Iran that spanned several centuries. If you were to look on a modern map, Iran is where it all started as far as the Persian Empire was concerned. The first Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great, we've talked about him before, that was around, he started his rise in prominence around 550 BC. And it was his empire, of course, that became one of the largest empires in history, stretching from Europe's Balkan Peninsula in the west to India's Indus Valley in the east. And you can kind of get a sense of that from just the large area covered by the Persian Empire in its heyday on the screen. Again, there on the right, you've got the Indus River in India, and it stretches all the way west, clear into Egypt and into modern day Greece. So an incredibly large swath of land. This Iron Age dynasty, sometimes called the Achaemenid Empire, was a global hub of culture, religion, science, art, and technology for more than 200 years before it fell to the invading armies of Alexander the Great. And by the way, we'll have some time to start talking about him, Lord willing, in our next class period. Cyrus the Great, the leader of one such tribe, began to defeat nearby kingdoms, including Media, Lydia, and Babylon, joining them under one rule. He founded the first Persian Empire, also known as the Achaemenid Empire, in 550 BC. The first Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great became soon one of the world's first superpowers. It united under one government three important sites of early human civilization in the ancient world: Mesopotamia, Egypt's Nile Valley, and India's Indus Valley. The next slide, we'll take a look at the list of kings, the kings of Persia from about 550 BC to 330 BC. And I do this just to kind of get you a sense historically of kind of where some Bible characters fit into this. If you've done any work in this area, and again, these dates are approximate, and going back and studying ancient history, and sometimes the information is limited. It's hard to know exact dates, but by most scholarly accounts, this is kind of what you got going on. And of course, Cyrus the Great there is the first on the list, all the way down to Darius III in around 330 BC, and of course, that is where you've got the rise of Alexander the Great, and the Persians, are gone from at least dominance in that part of history. You see on the right there some of the biblical characters and where they fit into that timeline. You've got Daniel there, and of course, he continued. He was there in Babylon when Cyrus the Great came in and conquered the city and the nation. And he stayed in Babylon under Cyrus and continued his work for God there. And of course, Cyrus was the one who issued the decree that the Jews could go back to their homeland and rebuild the city and the temple and the walls. And Zerubbabel and others were some that took that first wave of exiles back to Jerusalem. Again, that was right around 539 BC, 538 BC, somewhere in that time period. You've got a few more rulers till you get down to Ahasuerus and Artaxerxes. And of course, in that time period, roughly 486 BC to 424 BC, you've got some other biblical names that come into the timeline. You've got Esther, and depending on which version you read, you've got Ahasuerus or Xerxes. He went by either name apparently. Anyway, that's where she fits in. And then you've got Ezra, who led at least one or two groups of exiles back to the land. Again, this is some 100 years later in the timeline, perhaps a little earlier than that. And then Nehemiah as well. He took some exiles back to Jerusalem. And again, those three biblical figures fit into the timeline there. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a picture. I know sometimes we talk about a lot of names and dates, and it's hard to keep them all straight. So perhaps seeing it like this will be of help to you. Darius the first, or the Great, the fourth king of the Achaemenid Empire, ruled over the Persian Empire when it was at its largest, stretching from the Caucasus and Western Asia to what was then Macedonia, the Black Sea, Central Asia, and into Africa, including parts of Libya and Egypt. He unified the empire through introducing standard currency and weights and measures, making Aramaic the official language, and building roads. Historically, we've got something called the Behistun inscription. That was a multilingual relief, or that just means it was carved into the rock in various languages. It was carved into Mount Behistun in western Iran, and it extols his virtues of Darius, and was a critical key to deciphering cuneiform script. The impact of the Behistun inscription is compared to that of the Rosetta Stone. You perhaps are more familiar with that name. The Rosetta Stone was, again, a multilingual thing. It helped translators or linguists start to understand ancient languages because they've got two to compare. So anyway, that was the tablet, of course, the Rosetta Stone, that enabled scholars to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphics. So the Behistun inscription went a long way to help scholars understand cuneiform. The Persians, we know from history, were the first people to establish regular routes of communication between three continents: Africa, Asia, and Europe. And as you saw again from that map earlier, a pretty large stretch of country. And if you're going to keep control over that, you better find a way to communicate. And they developed that. They built many new roads and developed the world's first postal service. So that's a bit of interest there as well. Let's talk now about some of the Persian culture of Persia. Got some pictures here to help out. The ancient Persians of the Achaemenid Empire created art in many forms, including metalwork, rock carvings, weaving, and architecture. As the Persian Empire expanded to encompass other artistic centers of early civilization, again, the conquering nation would go out and envelop other cultures and kind of add that to their own. As the Persian Empire expanded to encompass those other artistic centers of early civilization, a new style was formed with influence from these sources. Early Persian art included large carved rock reliefs cut into cliffs, such as those found at like Naqash-e-Rustam. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. This was an ancient cemetery filled with the tombs of Achaemenid kings. The elaborate rock murals depict equestrian scenes and battle victories. So you get a large sense of that here in this particular side. What incredible work it took to carve into the rock here and build these tombs. Another picture here, a little bit closer, shows you some of that. So incredible artistic work here. Ancient Persians, we know from history, were also known for their metalwork. In the 1870s, smugglers discovered gold and silver artifacts among ruins near the Oxus River in present-day Tajikistan. The artifacts included a small golden chariot, coins and bracelets decorated in a griffin motif. Of course, if you know your history, a griffin was a mythical creature with wings and the head of an eagle and the body of a lion, and a symbol of the Persian capital of Persepolis. We'll see some pictures from Persepolis before we're done as well. British diplomats and members of the military serving in Pakistan brought roughly 180 of these gold and silver pieces, known as the Oxus treasure, to London, where they're now housed at the British Museum. Here's a picture of that chariot. What elaborate metalwork done there. Here's a couple other pictures from the Oxus treasure as well in the British Museum. Again, intricate metalwork. Here is some more that you can kind of gives you a sense of what's going on there. The history, and perhaps what's best known when you think about Persian art, would be Persian rugs, right? Here's an example of an ancient Persian rug. The history of carpet weaving in Persia dates back to the nomadic tribes. The ancient Greeks prized the artistry of these hand-woven rugs, famous for their elaborate design and bright colors. Today, most Persian rugs are made of wool, silk, and cotton. So this is one facet of Persian culture that perhaps you're most familiar with. Let's talk now, as we move on, about Persepolis. We mentioned that name a moment ago as the capital of the Persian Empire, at least at one point in its history. It says the ancient Persian capital of Persepolis, situated in southern Iran, ranks among the world's greatest historical sites. It was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1979. The Achaemenian palaces of Persepolis were built upon massive terraces. You see an example of that in this particular slide. They were decorated with ornamental facades that included long rock relief carvings for which the ancient Persians were famous. So you get a picture there again of the elaborate artwork here. Let's look at a couple other slides. This gives you a perspective here of just the massive size of these constructions. You see the people there walking between these massive rock carvings. Here's another slide of those walls that, again, they're beautiful now at this distance in history, but perhaps you can imagine what it must have been like to see them when they were brand new, and how elaborate and beautiful they must have been. All right, let's spend some time here talking about some of the Persian religion as well. Many people think of Persia as synonymous with Islam, and of course that's the world we live in today, isn't it? Although Islam was it only became the dominant religion in the Persian Empire after the Arab conquest of the 7th century. So Islamic domination of this area of the world today is only as new as the 7th century AD. The first Persian Empire was shaped by a different religion, and that's named Zoroastrianism. Perhaps you've heard of that, studying other things. Named after the Persian prophet Zoroaster, also known as Zarathustra, Zoroastrianism is one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions. It is still practiced today as a minority religion in parts of Iran and Syria. Zoroaster, who likely lived sometime between 1500 and 500 BC, taught followers to worship one god instead of the many deities worshipped by the earlier Indo-Iranian groups. The Achaemenid kings were devout Zoroastrians. By most accounts, Cyrus the Great was a tolerant ruler who allowed his subjects to speak their own languages and practice their own religions. We've already talked about the the tolerance of Cyrus, and again, him being the one to allow the Jews to go back to their homeland, something that was very out of character for conquering kings in those days. When Cyrus ruled, while Cyrus ruled by the Zoroastrian law of Ashah, truth and righteousness, that's what it translated means, he didn't impose Zoroastrianism on the people of Persia's conquered territories. The Hebrew scriptures praise Cyrus the Great for freeing the Jewish people of Babylon from captivity and allowing them to return to Jerusalem. Subsequent rulers in the Achaemenid Empire followed Cyrus the Great's hands-off approach to social and religious affairs, allowing Persia's diverse citizenry to continue practicing their own way of life. This period of time is sometimes called the Pax Persica, or Persian peace. You've perhaps heard of the Pax Romana, and that's the Roman peace. And of course, that was what kind of laid the groundwork, God using that time of relative world stability for the growth of Christianity. Well, there was an earlier Pax, referred to by historians as the Pax Persica. This symbol you see on your slide here is called Farah Bahar. It's the ancient symbol of the Zoroastrian faith. It depicts a bearded man with one hand reaching forward. He stands above a pair of wings that are outstretched from a circle representing eternity. Fire is another important symbol of Zoroastrianism, as it represents light and warmth and has purifying powers. So again, giving you a little background there. Let's kind of close the class period at this point by just hinting at the fall of the Persian Empire. As we've talked up to this point, you know, the Persian Empire in its heyday was a massive world empire, stretching and covering a lot of the surface of the Middle East. But as all worldly empires do, we've talked about that before, they rise and they fall. Any earthly empire is only doomed to have dominance for, it seems like, a relatively short period of time, historically speaking. And the Persian period entered a period of decline as well. As strong as it was under Cyrus the Great and some of the succeeding kings to him, a period of decline started after a failed invasion of Greece by Xerxes I in 480 BC. The costly defense of Persia's lands depleted the empire's funds, leading to heavier taxation among Persia's subjects. Isn't that, you know, kind of a cycle that repeats itself? The larger an empire gets, what comes along with that? It becomes harder to defend your borders. And the more you expand, the more, again, it takes to protect that, the more money it takes to run it. And that becomes a problem. And then the ruling power starts to impose heavier and heavier taxation, and that causes unrest. And all these factors come into play to weaken Persia to the point where it became ripe for the next rising power. And of course, that's Alexander the Great and the Greeks. The Achaemenid dynasty finally fell to the invading armies of Alexander the Great of Macedon in 330 BC. Subsequent rulers sought to restore the Persian Empire to its previous boundaries, though the empire never regained the enormous size that it achieved under Cyrus the Great. So once again, we kind of see hints of you know, we looked at the story of Daniel in some of the early classes, and how through Daniel's visions to even Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, that you'd have the Babylonians taken over by the Persians. The Persians, Daniel prophesied, would be overtaken by the Greeks. The Greeks would be overtaken by the Romans. And of course, that puts us into the New Testament time period there. So that's why we're studying this history, tracing it as we move closer to the time. It's things that are happening in this period, and the Persians here right at the beginning of the intertestamental period, the end of the Old Testament, the beginning of the New, a roughly 400-year time period from around 400 BC to 0 or 1 AD. The Persians were the first part of that, and that's where they fit into this puzzle that we're studying. So I hope that makes some sense. Learning about some things from our past. These things happened a long time ago, but they are key to understanding the life of Jesus and why he did and said some of the things he did and said, as well as for the apostles. The New Testament wasn't written in a vacuum. There were reasons why certain things were in place and why Jesus was opposed. And that's why we're spending some time to look at all the events that build toward what we've been talking about. So God bless. I hope you have a great week. Look forward to worshiping with you this coming Sunday. Have a great week.